It was a Tuesday afternoon in late November 1984, inside a modest, cluttered apartment in West Dennis, Massachusetts, where the air smelled of stale cigarette smoke and the damp, salt-heavy chill of a Cape Cod winter. The television was likely droning in the background, a low hum of daytime programming that filled the silence of a life that had slowly unraveled over 2 decades. Barbara Walker, a woman worn down by years of psychological attrition, alcohol, and a pervasive, gnawing fear, stood looking at a metal object that did not belong in the chaotic domesticity of her world. It was a toolbox. To the uninitiated eye, it was merely a repository for wrenches, screwdrivers, and the accumulated debris of household maintenance. But to Barbara, who had lived in the shadow of a man who compartmentalized his life with sociopathic precision, the box was a heavy, cold artifact of deceit. She had seen inside it before. She knew what lay beneath the false bottom and the innocent clutter of hardware. There were no blueprints for a home renovation or receipts for car parts. Instead, there were maps of rural roads in Maryland and Virginia, photographs of wooded areas marked with precise X's, and instructions typed on small index cards that detailed drop sites and signal locations. There were rows of numbers, codes, that meant nothing to a housewife, but everything to the superpowers currently locked in a nuclear standoff across the globe. This was not just a toolbox. It was the mobile archive of the most damaging espionage ring in the history of the United States Navy. It was the physical manifestation of a betrayal so deep it had rendered the entire Atlantic submarine fleet vulnerable to a Soviet first strike. And in that quiet, desperate moment in Massachusetts, Barbara Walker was no longer just a battered wife. She was the only person in the Western world holding the key to stopping a hemorrhage of secrets that had been flowing to Moscow for 17 years. To understand the magnitude of what lay inside that metal box, one must step back from the domestic ruin of the Walker family and look at the geopolitical architecture of the Cold War in the late 1960s and 1970s. It was an era defined by the terrifying calculus of mutually assured destruction. The stability of the world rested on a delicate balance of terror, maintained primarily by the ability of American nuclear submarines, the boomers, to disappear into the vast, crushing depths of the oceans. These vessels, carrying Trident and Poseidon missiles, were the ultimate insurance policy. If the Soviet Union launched a surprise nuclear attack, the boomers would survive, hidden and silent, to deliver a retaliatory blow that would erase the aggressor from the map. The efficacy of this deterrent relied entirely on silence and secrecy. If the Soviets could track these submarines, if they knew where they were patrolling, the insurance policy was void. The game of cat and mouse played out beneath the waves of the Atlantic and the Pacific was the most critical front of the Cold War. It was a game of acoustics, thermal layers, and mathematical prediction. But above all, it was a game of communication. The orders sent to these submarines and the reports they sent back were encrypted using the most sophisticated cipher machines in existence. The KW-7, the KWR-37, these were the holy grails of cryptographic security. They used complex rotor systems and daily key lists to scramble messages into incoherent noise that even the most powerful supercomputers of the time could not break. Unless, of course, someone gave them the keys. The security of the entire Western Alliance assumed that the cryptographic systems were inviolable. The National Security Agency, NSA, and the Navy operated on the premise that while men might be fallible, the mathematics of the codes were sound. They believed that without the daily key lists, the specific settings for the rotors that changed every 24 hours, the intercepted signals were useless static. This assumption was the bedrock of American naval strategy. But in the late 1960s, a fissure had opened in that bedrock, not through a breakthrough in Soviet mathematics, but through the greed and narcissism of a single chief warrant officer named John Anthony Walker, Jr. John Walker was not an ideologue. He was not a committed communist who believed in the inevitable triumph of the proletariat. He was, by all accounts, a man driven by a toxic cocktail of financial mismanagement, profound arrogance, and a desire for a James Bond lifestyle that his Navy salary could not support. In late 1967, Walker was stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, the beating heart of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. He was a communications watch officer, a role that gave him access to the flow of top-secret traffic entering and leaving the command center. He saw the messages. He held the key lists. He understood the machines. And he was broke. He had invested in a bar in South Carolina that was failing. His marriage to Barbara was deteriorating into a cycle of screaming matches and silence, and his car was falling apart. In his mind, the solution was simple. He didn't see treason. He saw a business transaction. In December 1967, he drove his beat-up car to Washington, D.C., parked, and walked into the Soviet embassy. It was a move of staggering recklessness. He carried with him a key list for the KL-47 cipher machine. When he spoke to the embassy staff, he didn't offer political sympathy. He offered the codes to the U.S. Navy's encrypted communications, and he asked for cash. The KGB resident in the embassy must have been stunned. Walk-ins were viewed with extreme suspicion. They were often FBI dangles or lunatics. But the document Walker presented was genuine. It was the keys to the kingdom. From that moment, John Walker became Agent Number 1, and later, as the operation grew, he would be handled by some of the KGB's most elite officers for the next 17 years. While the Navy spent billions developing quieter submarines and better sonar, John Walker was selling the Soviets the ability to read the Navy's mail in real time. The operational mechanism of the Walker spy ring was a masterclass in low-tech tradecraft, surviving in a high-tech world. It was brutal, physical, and relentlessly effective. Walker did not use high-frequency radios or complex electronic dead drops. He used the landscape of the American suburbs. The exchange was the heartbeat of the operation. It happened twice a year, usually in Vienna, Austria, or later in various locations around the Washington, D.C. area. The domestic drop procedure was designed to be foolproof, relying on the anonymity of the mundane. Walker would spend weeks photographing documents. He used a Minox subminiature camera, a piece of equipment that became an extension of his own hand. He would set up a makeshift studio in his home, often right under the nose of his family, clamping the camera to a tripod and photographing key lists, technical manuals, and future rotor settings page by page. The sheer volume was staggering. He wasn't just stealing a memo here or there. He was stealing the entire cryptographic logic of the Navy. Once the film was exposed, it was undeveloped and placed in a package. The drop protocol involved a complex dance of signals. Walker would drive a specific route, a surveillance detection route, designed to flush out any FBI tails. He would look for a signal from his KGB handler, perhaps a soda can crushed in a specific way at the base of a telephone pole, or a mark on a mailbox. If the signal was on, he would proceed to the drop site. These sites were chosen for their isolation and ordinariness. A wooded path in rural Maryland, a muddy turnoff near a creek. Walker would leave his package, often disguised as a piece of trash, a 7-Eleven bag, or a dirty soda bottle, hidden under leaves or debris. He would then proceed to a second location to retrieve his payment and new instructions. The KGB paid him well, though perhaps not as well as the damage warranted. Over the years, he collected roughly $1 million, a sum that fueled his lifestyle of vans, houseboats, private planes, and hairpieces, but never enough to truly escape the grind of his double life. The genius of Walker's operation, and the reason it lasted so long, was his ability to manipulate the human element. He understood that technology was only as secure as the people who operated it. As he moved up in rank and eventually retired from the Navy, he realized he needed access he no longer had. He needed a network. This is where the story shifts from a tale of individual treason to something more grotesque, a family business of espionage. Walker didn't just recruit strangers, he cannibalized his own circle. He first targeted his friend, Jerry Whitworth, a naval radio man who, like Walker, felt the world owed him more than he was getting. Whitworth, operating under the handle D, became a prolific source of cryptographic data from the Pacific Fleet, effectively closing the circle. Now the Soviets had eyes in both oceans, but Walker didn't stop there. He recruited his brother, Arthur Walker, a retired lieutenant commander who worked for a defense contractor. And, in the ultimate act of narcissistic depravity, he groomed and recruited his own son, Michael Walker, a young sailor stationed on the USS Nimitz. John Walker had turned espionage into a franchise. He was the CEO, managing his assets, collecting the product, skimming a large percentage of the KGB's payments for himself, and distributing the rest to his employees. He justified it all with a cynical worldview he preached to his children and friends. The government was corrupt, the system was rigged, and the only sin was not getting your share. He viewed himself not as a traitor, but as a pragmatist, a man who had outsmarted the system. But there was a flaw in John Walker's carefully compartmentalized universe. He had underestimated the person he had marginalized the most, his wife, Barbara. For years, Barbara Walker had lived in a purgatory of suspicion and abuse. In the early days of the marriage, John had tried to bring her into the fold, not as a spy, but as an accomplice to his secrecy. He had even taken her on some of his early drops, framing it as a thrilling adventure, a game they were playing. But as the reality of what he was doing sank in, the selling of their country's secrets to the enemy, Barbara recoiled. She drank to numb the terror. She withdrew. John, seeing her as a liability, pushed her away, treating her with contempt, mocking her intelligence, and eventually divorcing her in 1976. He left her in poverty, struggling to make ends meet working in a gift shop, while he flaunted his money and his freedom. He assumed that her alcoholism and her fear would keep her silent forever. He assumed that no one would believe the crazy ex-wife even if she did speak. He assumed that she still loved him enough, or feared him enough, to keep his secret. He was wrong. The inflection point came not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing accumulation of misery. Barbara watched from afar as John ensnared their children. She saw the influence he had on Michael. The fear that her son was being dragged into the same dark abyss that had swallowed her marriage was the catalyst. It was a maternal instinct overriding the paralysis of trauma. She realized that John was not just a traitor to the Navy. He was a predator feeding on his own kin. That night in November 1984, the alcohol didn't numb the pain. It clarified it. She looked at her life, the shabby apartment, the struggle to pay bills, the looming shadow of John's arrogance. She remembered the box. She remembered the trips. She remembered the fear in his eyes when he thought he was being watched, and the cruel laughter when he thought he was safe. She picked up the phone. The call was not to Washington, D.C. or the Pentagon. It was to the local FBI field office in Hyannis, Massachusetts. When the agent answered, Barbara didn't scream or cry. She spoke with the weary, flat affect of someone who has carried a burden for too long and is simply setting it down. She told them her ex-husband was a spy. She told them he had been spying for years. She told them about the trips, the cash, and the strange metal box he guarded with his life. Initial reports suggest the FBI was skeptical. Spousal accusations are common in bitter divorces, and the claims Barbara was making, that a warrant officer had compromised the entire cryptographic integrity of the U.S. Navy, seemed too fantastic, too catastrophic to be true. If she was right, the damage was incalculable. It meant every deployment, every strategic maneuver, every contingency plan for the last decade and a half had been transparent to the Kremlin. But the Bureau did what the Bureau does. They opened a file. They interviewed her. And as Barbara spoke, the details began to align with certain anomalies the counterintelligence community had noticed, but never solved. The unexplainable Soviet knowledge of U.S. naval exercises, the speed with which Soviet submarines reacted to American deployments. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered for years, began to magnetically drift toward the center of the table. The investigation that followed, code-named Windflyer, was a masterpiece of surveillance and patience. The FBI couldn't just arrest John Walker based on Barbara's word. They needed to catch him in the act. They needed to see the tradecraft. They needed the physical evidence that would stand up in court, and more importantly, allow the intelligence community to assess exactly what had been lost. They began to watch him. John Walker, now a private investigator living in Norfolk, prided himself on his ability to spot a tail. He drove a van, he owned a plane, he was constantly on the move. The FBI surveillance teams had to be perfect. They used aircraft, multiple vehicles, and agents in disguise to track his movements without alerting him. They tapped his phones. They built a profile of his routine. In May 1985, the break came. Intercepts and surveillance indicated that Walker was preparing for a drop. He was gathering the product, classified material solicited from his son Michael on the USS Nimitz and from Jerry Whitworth. The FBI knew the schedule. They knew the likely area. On May 19, 1985, John Walker left his home in Norfolk and began his run. He drove north toward the rural roads of Montgomery County, Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. The FBI was with him every mile of the way. It was a tense, high-stakes procession. Walker was practicing his tradecraft, stopping abruptly, changing speeds, doubling back. He was cleaning his route. The agents had to hang back, terrified of spooking him, yet terrified of losing him. Walker eventually turned down a lonely wooded road. He stopped near a utility pole marked 71. This was the drop site. He got out of his van, clutching a grocery bag. Inside were 129 classified documents stolen from the USS Nimitz. He placed the bag in the brush, covered it with leaves and a soda can, and drove off. This was the moment of truth. The FBI agents waited. They expected a Soviet diplomat or KGB officer to emerge from the woods or drive by to pick up the package. They wanted the handler as much as they wanted Walker. They waited in the darkness, weapons ready, eyes straining against the gloom. But no one came. Somewhere in the chain of signals, something had gone wrong. Perhaps the KGB had spotted the surveillance earlier in the day. Perhaps the signal site had been disturbed. The Soviets, masters of caution, had aborted the pickup. Walker, unaware that the drop had not been serviced, continued to his payment site, expecting to find a bag of cash. He found nothing. Frustrated and confused, He returned to the drop site to retrieve the stolen documents, a cardinal sin in tradecraft, but he was desperate. He couldn't leave the documents there if he wasn't getting paid. He retrieved the bag and drove to a Ramada Inn in Rockville, Maryland, to sleep off his frustration. He didn't know that the FBI had watched the entire fumble. They had seen him place the bag, seen him retrieve it. They had enough. In the early hours of the morning, the tactical teams moved in. They secured the perimeter of the hotel. Agents approached his room. When John Walker opened the door, he reportedly reached for a gun, but the reality of the situation crashed down on him before he could act. He was pinned, handcuffed, and the bag of classified documents was seized. The master spy had been caught in a cheap motel room, undone by a missed connection and the vengeful conscience of the wife he had discarded. The arrest of John Walker triggered a domino effect that shattered the spy ring. Within days, the FBI moved on the other members. Michael Walker was arrested aboard the USS Nimitz. When agents searched his bunk, they found a stash of classified documents hidden near his sleeping quarters. The young sailor, manipulated by his father, crumbled quickly. Arthur Walker was picked up in Virginia. Jerry Whitworth, the radio man who had supplied the critical crypto keys from the Pacific, was arrested in California. The interrogation of John Walker was a journey into the mind of a sociopath. He showed little remorse for the damage he had done to his country. His concerns were transactional. How much time would he serve? Could he cut a deal? He seemed to view the entire affair as a game he had played well, only to lose on a technicality. He even tried to frame his espionage as an effort to foster peace, claiming that by showing the Soviets the US had no intention of attacking, he had prevented war. It was a delusion that fooled no one. The consequences of the Walker spy ring were catastrophic. As the damage assessment teams from the NSA and the Navy began to sift through the debriefings, the blood drained from their faces. It wasn't just a few documents. Walker and his network had supplied the Soviets with the daily key settings for the KW-7, the KWR-37, and the KG-14 machines for years. This meant that the KGB had been able to decipher over 1 million encrypted naval messages. They knew the location of US submarines. They knew the patrol routes. They knew the technical capabilities of the torpedoes and the missiles. They knew the contingency plans for war in Europe. In a briefing to the president, high-ranking officials admitted that had a war broken out between the US and the USSR during the 1970s, the Soviets would likely have won the naval engagement decisively. The American advantage, the silent service, had been nullified. The Soviets had been reading the playbook the entire time. The revelation forced a massive, agonizing overhaul of the entire US military communications infrastructure. Every code machine had to be replaced or modified. Every protocol for handling keys had to be rewritten. The cost was estimated in the billions of dollars, but the strategic cost was incalculable. It took years for the Navy to regain the confidence that their communications were secure. John Walker pleaded guilty in exchange for a lenient sentence for his son, Michael. He was sentenced to life in prison. Jerry Whitworth received 365 years. Arthur Walker received life. Michael Walker served 15 years, but the story ends where it began. With Barbara, after the arrests, after the media circus that dubbed 1985 the year of the spy, the cameras turned to the woman who had blown the whistle. Barbara Walker was not celebrated as a hero in the traditional sense. She was viewed with a complex mixture of pity and curiosity. Why had she waited so long? Why had she stayed silent while the codes were being photographed in her own home? The answer lay in the insidious nature of the domestic trap John had built. He had weaponized her love, her fear, and her own vulnerabilities against her. He had made her an accessory before she even understood the crime, binding her to him with the glue of shared guilt. It took the threat to her son to finally break that bond. In the aftermath, the intelligence community had to grapple with a terrifying truth. The greatest threat to national security had not been a high-tech Soviet breakthrough or a mole in the CIA's upper echelons. It had been a greedy warrant officer with a devastatingly simple plan, a Minox camera, and a toolbox. The system had been designed to withstand mathematical assault, but it had not been designed to withstand the betrayal of a man who had security clearance. The Walker case changed the way the U.S. military looked at its own people. It ushered in an era of stricter background checks, financial monitoring of clearance holders, and the two-person integrity rule for handling cryptographic material. The idea that trust was a sufficient security measure died in that motel room in Rockville. Years later, looking back on the wreckage, the image that remains is not the high drama of the drop sites or the sterile corridors of the Kremlin where the stolen data was consumed. It is the image of that toolbox in the West Dennis apartment. It stands as a testament to the banality of evil. How treason can be stored next to a hammer and a wrench. How the fate of nations can rest in the hands of a dysfunctional family. And how the silence of a house can be louder and more dangerous than the sonar pings in the deep Atlantic. Barbara Walker passed away in the years following the trial, her legacy complicated but undeniable. She was the housewife who stopped the hemorrhage. She was the one who finally looked into the abyss of her husband's deception and decided that the price of silence was too high. In the history of the Cold War, amidst the generals and the statesmen and the master spies, she remains the pivotal figure who proved that sometimes the only difference between victory and defeat is a phone call made from a kitchen in Massachusetts. The investigation revealed that the KGB regarded the Walker Ring as the most important operation in their history, surpassing even the atomic spies of the 1940s. They had given John Walker the rank of admiral in the Soviet Navy in absentia. But to Barbara, he was just the man who had ruined their lives. The codes he stole were complex, but the reason he stole them was simple. And in the end, it was the simple, messy, human reality of a failed marriage that brought down the most sophisticated spy ring of the era. The toolbox was opened, the light was let in, and the secrets that had thrived in the dark were finally, irrevocably exposed. The operational details of the Walker Ring, the dead drops, the signal sites, the surveillance detection routes, became case studies at the FBI Academy and the Naval War College. They are taught today as examples of classic espionage tradecraft. But the psychological component is equally studied. The case highlighted the insider threat in neon lights. It forced a re-evaluation of what motivates a spy. It wasn't ideology, it was ego and money. It was the MICE acronym come to life. Money, ideology, compromise, ego. John Walker was driven by money and ego, and he used compromise to control his family. The legacy of the case is written in the improved security protocols of the modern Navy, but also in the lingering unease about the human element. We build systems of immense complexity, firewalls of logic and mathematics, but they are all operated by human beings with debts, grudges, and secrets. The Walker case is a permanent reminder that the fortress is only as strong as the soldier at the gate, and sometimes the soldier at the gate is selling the keys to pay for a houseboat. As the Cold War faded into history, the Walker case stood as a monument to the era's hidden struggles. It was a conflict fought not just with missiles, but with secrets. And in that silent war, the decisive battle wasn't fought in the Fulda Gap or the skies over Berlin. It was fought in the living room of the Walker family, where a woman finally decided to open the box and show the world the darkness inside. The codes were changed. The submarines sailed on, but the scar on the silent service remained, a reminder of how close we came to losing it all, and how a single thread, pulled by a trembling hand, unraveled the entire tapestry of Soviet intelligence dominance. The forensic analysis of the Walker Ring's impact continued for decades. Declassified Soviet archives later confirmed the extent of the breach. High-ranking KGB defectors spoke of the Walker yield with reverence. They described rooms in Moscow filled with analysts whose sole job was to process the intake from the Walker family. They admitted that they knew the location of every major U.S. naval unit at all times. The transparency was total. This retrospective clarity adds a chilling weight to the narrative. When we look back at the Cuban Missile Crisis or the tensions of 1983, we often think of the visible maneuvering. But beneath that, in the 1970s and 80s, there was this invisible vulnerability. The American public slept under a blanket of security that was, in reality, threadbare. The deterrent was compromised, the shield was cracked, and the man holding the hammer was a smiling, toupee-wearing private investigator who thought he was smarter than everyone else. It is a story of paradoxes. The greatest security breach was committed by a patriot posturing warrant officer. The most sophisticated codes were defeated by a consumer-grade camera. The might of the KGB was brought down by a neglected wife. And the fate of the free world, for a time, sat in a rusty toolbox in a garage, waiting for someone to notice. The mechanics of the betrayal were intricate, involving rotor settings and daily key lists. But the mechanics of the exposure were primal. It was betrayal met with betrayal. John Walker betrayed his country. Barbara Walker betrayed John. In the calculus of the Cold War, her betrayal was the act of salvation. It reset the board. It forced the U.S. Navy to rebuild its nervous system. It closed the blind eye. Today, the Walker case is a historical chapter, but the lessons are living. The Walker spy ring is a shorthand for catastrophic compromise, but it should also be shorthand for the power of the overlooked observer. Barbara Walker was the ultimate counterintelligence asset, not because she was trained, but because she was there. She saw the discrepancies. She felt the lies, and when the burden became too great, she acted. The toolbox is gone, the codes are obsolete, but the warning remains. The most dangerous secrets are often hidden in the most ordinary places, and the person who finds them might just be the one you least expect. The final dossier on John Walker closes with his death in prison in 2014. He took many secrets to the grave, likely including the full extent of what he passed to the Soviets in the early years. But the dossier on the case itself remains open in the sense that it is the benchmark for damage. Every subsequent spy case, Ames, Hansen, is measured against the Walker standard. Did they give up as much? Did they last as long? Did they involve their families? In the end, the story of the housewife and the toolbox is not just a spy story. It is a tragedy of American life during the Cold War, where the pressure of the global conflict cracked the foundation of a single home, and the fissures spread outward until they threatened to swallow the world. It is a reminder that history is not just made in situation rooms. It is made in kitchens, in garages, and in the quiet, desperate decisions of ordinary people pushed to the brink. The codes were the weapon, but the toolbox was the coffin of a marriage, and ultimately, the coffin of the Soviet Union's greatest intelligence triumph. The silence that followed the arrest of the Walkers was the silence of a system in shock. The Navy had to learn to speak again, in new codes, with new keys. The submarines returned to the deep, this time truly silent, truly hidden. The balance was restored. But for those who lived through the year of the spy, the trust was never quite the same. The ghost of John Walker, smiling and snapping photos in his den, haunted the corridors of the Pentagon for a generation. And somewhere in the archives of the FBI, there is likely a photo of a metal toolbox, a mundane object that once held the end of the world inside its rusted latch. The narrative of the Walker ring serves as a grim masterclass in the vulnerability of secrets. It demonstrates that while encryption is mathematical, security is biological. It lives and dies with the people who hold the keys. The Soviet Union didn't need to break the enigma. They just needed to find a man with a grievance and a camera. They found John Walker, and for 17 years, that was enough. But they forgot about Barbara. And in the long, twilight struggle of the Cold War, that was their fatal mistake. The housewife in the Toolbox story is the variable that couldn't be calculated, the rotor setting that didn't fit the pattern. She was the anomaly, and she was the end of the line. The investigation, the trial, the sentencing, these were the procedural outcomes. But the true climax was that moment in West Dennis, the hand on the phone, the voice trembling but clear. My husband is a spy. 5 words that dismantled a 17-year operation. 5 words that secured the Atlantic. 5 words that proved that in the world of shadows, the light can come from anywhere. The Walker case remains the definitive example of the family spy ring, a grotesque distortion of the American dream where the family business is treason. It is a story that begins with a walk-in at an embassy and ends with a walk-in at a field office. A perfect circle of betrayal, closed by the one person John Walker thought didn't matter. As we analyze the historical record, the Walker era of espionage stands as a distinct period of darkness for U.S. counterintelligence. It was a time when the enemy was inside the wire, reading the mail, and laughing at the locks. It took a catastrophic failure of John Walker's domestic control, his failure to manage his wife, to end the failure of the Navy's operational control. The irony is absolute. The spy who controlled everything could not control his own home. And that, in the final analysis, was the flaw that saved the West. The toolbox, the camera, the drop sites, the codes, these are the artifacts. The story is the human cost. The story is the housewife who found the courage to stop the machine. And in the annals of Cold War history, amidst the titans and the tyrants, Barbara Walker's name is written in the invisible ink of gratitude, a silent guardian who didn't wear a uniform, but who won a decisive victory in a war she never asked to join. The codes were broken, but thanks to her, the line held. The boomers remained hidden, the deterrent survived, and the Cold War, eventually, came to an end, leaving behind only the stories of how close we came to the edge and who pulled us back. The operational reality of the Walker ring was a testament to the power of the low-tech approach. While the NSA built supercomputers to crack codes, Walker used a 7-Eleven bag to bypass them. While the Navy spent billions on satellite communications, Walker used a soda can to signal a drop. This asymmetry is the hallmark of successful espionage. It exploits the blind spots of a technological superpower. The U.S. was looking for electronic signals, for cyber intrusions, for high-altitude intercepts. They weren't looking for a man in a van dropping a bag of trash in the woods. This disconnect between the sophistication of the target and the simplicity of the attack method is what allowed Walker to operate for so long. He flew under the radar because he was the radar's operator. He knew the system from the inside. He knew what the Navy was looking for, so he gave them nothing to see. Until he got sloppy. Until he got arrogant. Until he forgot that his wife was watching. The Windflyer operation that brought him down was the counter-move. It was the FBI acknowledging that to catch a spy like Walker, they had to get down in the mud with him. They had to watch the trees, not just the airwaves. They had to track the man, not just the signal. And when they did, they found him exactly where Barbara said he would be. Playing his game, hiding his secrets, believing he was untouchable. The arrest at the Ramada Inn was the punctuation mark at the end of a long, run-on sentence of negligence. It was the moment the U.S. government finally woke up to the reality of the threat. The images of Walker in handcuffs, the bag of documents, the bewildered look on his face, these became the iconography of the scandal. But the real image, the one that should be remembered, is the toolbox. The box that sat in the corner of a room, ignored, gathering dust, while inside, the secrets of the nuclear age waited to be discovered. It is a story that demands to be remembered, not just for the damage done, but for the lesson learned. The lesson that vigilance begins at home, that character matters, that the people we trust with our secrets must be worthy of that trust, and that sometimes the most important intelligence report doesn't come from a satellite or a defector, but from a voice on the phone saying, "I found something. I think you need to see it." The Walker case is closed. The participants are dead or aged. The codes are long changed. But the echo of that discovery in the toolbox still resonates. It is a reminder of the fragility of secrets and the power of truth. In the end, the truth was the only thing John Walker couldn't hide, and it was the only thing Barbara Walker couldn't live without. The collision of those two realities created the spark that burned down the spy ring and illuminated the shadows of the Cold War's most dangerous decade. The toolbox was the tinderbox, and Barbara Walker lit the match.